A book called The Wise Men was first published in 1986. Cover copy says, quote, "It was about six friends and the world they made," unquote. The names Harriman, Lovett, Acheson, McCloy, Kennan, and Bohlen are only to be found in the history books today. Co-authors Evan Thomas and Walter Isaacson were in their mid-30s. In the updated 2012 introduction to the paperback, they wrote, "In their time, the Wise Men operated largely behind the scenes, little known by the public. But they achieved great things." According to Thomas and Isaacson, those great things included the shaping of the world order today, the creation of international institutions, the forging of lasting peace in a perilous time. We ask Evan Thomas, now in his 70s, who are the wise men of today? Evan Thomas, can you remember what you felt like back in 1985, 86 when you were writing the Wise Men book and why you were doing it?
That Walter Isaacson and I were on the beginning of a great adventure. We were young and didn't know much about foreign policy, and this was a heck of a way to find out, was to go back to the kind of origin story, if you will. The United States at the end of World War II, about to become the world's great power. And this was not my idea. This was Walter's idea. But to find six men, a half dozen men, and of course in those days it was men, who took the U.S. on this trip. And so then the question became, who are they? And we had a lot of fun trying to figure that out. But we were young. We didn't know what the hell we were doing, which was made it much more fun and more interesting because we were learning as we went. We both were old enough to know a little bit, but just a little bit. So it was just exciting because it was the beginning of something for us. The whole thing was exciting.
I counted up to a number of Ivy League degrees among the six to start with: 4 from Harvard, 3 from Yale, 1 from Princeton, 1 from Amherst. That's including law degrees and all that stuff.
Yeah.
How important was that this group of 6 were together?
Very important. And the reason why I'm the co-author here is that this was Walter's idea to look at the old foreign policy establishment. It was also Alice Mayhew at Simon & Schuster. I was never sure whose idea this book was, whether it was Walter's idea or Alice's idea or Binky Urban, our agent's idea. I know it was not my idea, but it was their idea. But I come into this scene because Walter and I were pals at Time Magazine, and Walter needed somebody who understood and knew this world of Ivy League, preppies, whatever you want to call it, but this WASP establishment and their colleges who really played this very important role in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. Not so much now, or it's changed. We can talk about that later. But, and I knew that world because I'd grown up in an establishment town. I had gone to a boarding school and Harvard, and no, Walter gone to Harvard, but I was from that world. My dad was a book publisher who published people from that world. I had it in my blood, and I got it. I understood it, and Walter needed that. So that's why he asked me to do it with him.
The wise men were 6. And I want to name them each and have you give us a little bit of a background. Eventually, we'll get to talk about what happened after this group was around. By the way, the last one to be alive was Kennan in 2005. That's how long they've been.
Amazing. But 100 died, over 100.
Let's go to Averell Harriman. Who was he?
He was the son of a tycoon, railroad tycoon. Looked like a very handsome polo-playing playboy. And he was all that, but he was also stolid and kind of fierce. He could deal with Russians. That was important in 1945. He was just as tough as Stalin was. And, he had enormous self-confidence. He wasn't the smartest guy in the world. He was not the most charming. He was good looking, but not the most charming. But he was tough. He was a realist, and he could deal with Russians. And he had this global view. This is very important. He was a global businessman. He wasn't just doing America. He understood that the United States had economic ties to Europe, particularly, but also to Asia. And he was a globalist. That was a new thing in 1945, relatively. Remember, America had been isolationist before World War II. So he was a global businessman who could deal with Russians, and not unimportantly, Groton, Yale, Skull and Bones, in the very inside of this WASP hierarchy.
He died in 1986, right around the time the book came out. Did you talk to him?
Yeah, we did. He was grumpy and fierce with us. He gave us access to his archive, which was fantastic. It was full of all sorts of classified stuff. He'd probably get in trouble for it today. It was all in his basement, all of his classified files. Today you're not supposed to do that, but in his day, he just took it with him. And he was a grouchy old guy, but he understood what we were doing and talked to us.
Which of the six was he closest to?
Acheson, in the sense that they came up together from boarding school and college. I don't think Averell Harriman was close to anybody except for maybe Pamela Harriman, his last wife. He was a loner. He was not a fun guy. He had business relationships, but he certainly shared a common background. They both coached the Groton and Yale crews, that kind of thing. Very similar social background. They understood each other.
I'll get to Dean Acheson in a second, but I'm going to quickly rattle off
the
kind of jobs that Harriman had: ambassador to the Soviet Union, ambassador to the United Kingdom, Secretary of Commerce, Governor of New York, Assistant Secretary of State, and Undersecretary of State. If I'm misstating anything, just holler at me.
He wanted to be president, but he wasn't a good politician. He was governor of New York, but he was a bad politician, so he was never going to get there. Richard Holbrooke once told me. Richard Holbrooke, famous descendant to these guys, actually, as a diplomat. Richard Holbrooke told me that Averell Harriman's the only ambitious octogenarian I know. In other words, when he was 80 years old, he was just as ambitious as when he was 20. And he couldn't get the top job at the State Department in the Kennedy administration. So he took an assistant secretaryship because he was still ambitious. He's just the way he was. I kind of admired him for that. They called him the crocodile because he would sit there, he was deaf, and he would sit there looking like he was asleep, but then he'd snap your head off. He was fierce. He was a fierce bureaucratic infighter.
What did he think of the Soviet Union back then?
You could do business with him. I mean, he was anti-communist, but importantly, he said you can do business with these guys. Imagine how monolithic the Soviet Union looked and how impenetrable it was. The CIA called it the denied territory. CIA had no agents in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. You couldn't get inside. Averell Harriman could get inside because he could deal with these people. He could trade with them, talk to them.
Dean Acheson, Yale, Harvard law degree, Secretary of State 49, 53, Undersecretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State 44, 45. What's the profile on him?
He's haughty, superior. If you have a cliche of what a Groton Yale guy looks like, it's Dean Acheson. He had a sort of a faux aristocratic accent, wore nice suits, looked superior, felt superior, and here's the thing, was superior. He was smarter. He was a great Secretary of State in most ways. He had this worldview. The United States has got to be in the world here. The world is falling apart after 1945. And we, the United States, has got to step in, stand up to the Russians, rebuild Western Europe. It's the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe. That's really the Acheson Plan. Acheson was the driving force behind it. And the important thing is America, this word Pax Americana, take off on Pax Britannica. England is finished. Britain is toast. They are exhausted and broke from World War II. Somebody has to step in the void. Who? The United States. And he wrote a book, his memoirs, Acheson's memoirs are called President at the Creation. Very, like biblical, right? Like he's God. present at the creation, and the creation was of the Pax Americana. And there's a moment in his office when the British can't pay for taking care of Greece and Turkey and the Mediterranean, kind of obscure and lost in time. But it's the moment when the United States takes over running the world. And Dean Acheson, who's then the number 2 guy at the State Department, he's the guy who's behind it.
I got him as dying in October of 1971, so I assume you never met him. However, did your dad publish any of these men's books?
Yeah, my dad's partner in publishing, Eric Swenson and Norton, published President of the Creation. My dad knew him. I got to know his wife, his widow. She was great. I knew his son. I knew the Acheson family.
What was Dean Acheson's relationships to the different presidents that he served?
Really importantly, great with Harry Truman. I love, this is one of history's great odd couples. Harry Truman is a haberdasher, failed haberdasher from Kansas City. He's no preppy. He didn't even go to college. And yet, Dean Acheson was, among his qualities, was he was very loyal. And there's a great scene when the Democrats have lost the 46th congressional election, and Harry Truman, this kind of accidental president, is coming back from Kansas City, and there's only one person to meet him at the train, Dean Acheson. And they became best friends. And they were alike because they were blunt and critical and tough and practical. And they formed a great friendship. I think Acheson called, what did he call Truman? Oh, my captain, something like Captain, my captain. And they forged this alliance that really helped create the Western world. NATO, Marshall Plan. That's Truman and Acheson. It's a very unlikely alliance, but boy, did it work.
Did he have quarrels with any of these guys? Because he, as you say, he was so strong personally.
Sure. I mean, the unfortunate side. I'm going to get in the weeds a tiny bit here. Alger Hiss is a communist spy. He's a State Department guy, and Richard Nixon, a young congressman, realizes that Hiss is a spy, and in a complicated court case, outs him as a spy. And Acheson made the mistake of nobly trying to stand up for Hiss by quoting from the Bible that he was going to stand by his friend. Well, that was all very noble, but it made it look like Acheson was standing up for communists. And that hurt the State Department because that helped inflame the McCarthyites and the anti-communists, so that by being noble and standing by your friend, standing by Alger Hiss, I will not turn my back on Alger Hiss, was what Acheson said. He brought the dogs down on the State Department, and he made it harder for the State Department in the McCarthy era, these witch hunts going through, and really, so his righteousness, his noble righteousness, Acheson's noble righteousness, had the effect of hurting his own department, undermining his own power. I also thought that was a lesson in virtue signaling. Don't sound too righteous; it'll come back to haunt you.
Chip Bohlen died at age 69, the youngest of all of them. 3 of them lived to be in the 90s, and then one lived to be 101, which was George Kennan. But going back to Chip Bohlen, was he close at all to either Dean Acheson or Averell Harriman?
They all knew each other because it was such a small world. They all kind of had dinner together. I mean, Georgetown, you think of Georgetown society, it doesn't really exist anymore, but it sure did in 1947. There was something called the Sunday night supper, where it was maids' night out. Of course, they all had maids night out, and they would all get drunk together. And Bohlen and Acheson and Harriman, all these people were in and out of each other's households. They weren't necessarily close personal friends, but they all knew each other. They had a common bond, a shared experience, a shared worldview, and they all liked to get drunk together.
Who was Chip Bohlen?
He was a brilliant diplomat. He was the most charming of the group. He was a St. Paul's School, Harvard, Porcellian Club, the purest, most charming preppy you ever met. He was one of my father's. My father published his memoirs, so I know his family, and he was just as charming a guy. He was not as important as the other 5 guys. He didn't have as much power, but he was a great diplomat. He understood the Russians. He and Kennan, George Kennan, had been stationed in Russia in the 30s, and they got to know the Russian system, so he was good at dealing with Russians.
My list says ambassador to France, ambassador to the Philippines, ambassador to the Soviet Union, counselor of the State Department from Clayton, New York. And in your book, and we can get into some of this later, but while I'm thinking of it, he had a difficult health problem throughout his life. What was that?
Bohlen?
Yeah.
At the end, he wore a colostomy bag, I remember, which is very tough for him. The cigarettes and the booze finally got to him. Basically, as you said, four of the six lived to be over 90. We used to joke that martinis are good for your health because they certainly drank a lot of them. But Bohlen also smoked, and that will kill you. So I don't think he lived as long. Who else died? I guess Acheson did. I've forgotten who died younger. If you smoked, that killed you. Uh, and I don't remember if he had. What are you thinking of? He had a specific health program. What are you thinking
No,
of?
just at the end, you talk about the colostomy bag
Yeah,
and,
yeah. I
and
don't think there was a lifelong problem. I think he was. I think that was something that happened at the end, and it was degrading and sad for him, hard for him. He had a sad death that way, but I think it was just because he enjoyed himself too much during his life.
what did he care about the most when it came to policy?
That's a little hard to say. He wasn't ideological. He cared about being the sort of person that could deal with anybody, from Joseph Stalin on down. He was a diplomat in the best sense of the world. The United States has got to be the United States has got to be in the world. We can't just go home again. We have to deal with them. That's Chip Bohlen, and he's there. He's there. Yalta. He's there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's just kind of always there, helping out. He's not as significant a figure as the other five, but he stands for something, which is the United States has this role in the world, and we have to embrace it.
You mentioned the Porcellian Club. Tell us what that is. And I know you were a member of the Fly Club,
Yeah,
and and
I was a member of a lesser club. My FDR was rejected. Franklin Roosevelt was rejected by the Porcellian Club, which is the most exclusive club at Harvard still, and the sort of in those days the preppiest, most full of Boston Brahmins and New York rich kids. And FDR was rejected. He said it was the greatest wound of his life. The greatest wound, FDR, he had polio. The greatest wound of his life was getting rejected by the Porcellian Club. It sounds ridiculous, but that shows you how seriously 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds took it. And FDR had to settle for my club, the Fly Club, which was a lesser club. Uh, still a preppy club, but not as good as the Porcellian Club.
well, I also read that Joseph Kennedy, not senior but junior, wasn't allowed in the Porcellian Club either. And part of the reason they said was because he was Catholic.
Yeah, these clubs were horribly biased and exclusive. This will tell you something. John F. Kennedy, like the most charming human being ever, barely got into the Spee Club, which is sort of like the Fly Club, a middle level club at Harvard, because he was Irish Catholic. And his preppy Protestant friends had to kind of maneuver him in because as late as 1935, 36, Harvard clubs were still discriminating against Catholics. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe in our modern day, but that's just the truth. If you were Jewish, you didn't have a chance. Yeah, I think the clubs took their first blacks maybe in the 1960s. They were very biased, bigoted places. They that was the system. They just were. I cringe to even tell this now because it sounds so anarchic or archaic. Uh, but that's just the way it was.
By the way, you say you know the family, and I only not to go into detail about the family so much as what impact has it had on the family that their father was so involved in diplomacy back in those days?
Who are we talking about? Bohlen?
Poland, yes.
Yeah. Uh, his kids are wonderful. I know them all. And, it's not easy being a diplomat's kid because you're moving all over the world. But Avis, his daughter, was a very high ranked diplomat herself, number two in the Paris embassy. Uh, Celestine, a great reporter, terrific reporter at the New York Times and then Reuters. Charlie's, I think, a banker. They are elegant, charming people, just like their parents, worldly, and love their dad.
What's your experience about people in the families and the legacies? Did they get in these Ivy League schools because of?
Oh yeah, sure. And those legacies still worked. I mean, Celestine was in my class at Harvard. Charlie was a couple of classes ahead of me. I can't remember where Avis went, but yeah, in those days, this is not less true today. There's still legacy preference, but boy, in my day, it was a cinch.
John J. McCloy Jr. from Philadelphia, and he was chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, High Commissioner in Germany, president of the World Bank, and assistant secretary of war. What's he all about?
He's the outlier in the sense that he's not to the manner born. He used to say, "My mother did head." She was a hairdresser in Philadelphia, and he went to Amherst, which is a little bit one notch down the pecking order in those days, but obviously still today a fantastic school, and then a fantastic school then too, but not as prestigious as Harvard, Princeton, Yale. So he goes to Harvard Law School, and he joins this world and embraces it so much that by the time he's an old guy, Richard Rovere in the New Yorker famously says that talks about writes a funny story up, send up of the establishment. Who's the chairman of the board of the establishment? It's John J. McCloy. And McCloy always thought that was kind of amusing because McCloy said, "My mother did heads. I wasn't really part of that." But he was. Because, this is America. You can work your way in. It's not England. It's not totally hereditary. And McCloy was incredibly capable person. He sort of ran the State Department, excuse me, the War Department in World War II for Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and then had all sorts of jobs: High Commissioner in Germany, arms control negotiator. He was just kind of everywhere. Enormous. He got by being capable. He could do anything. He just was a competent, capable person. Now he did things that in his later life looked not so good. He helped set up those camps for Japanese for the Nisi in World War II. McCloy was very involved in that, and that was a source of. I was about to say shame. I don't think he was ever ashamed, but it sure didn't look good that they. It's just a sorry chapter in American history when we locked up 123 Japanese 120,000 Japanese Americans in World War II. McCloy was very much involved in that, and I don't know. I'm trying to think how he felt about it. I guess he felt that at the time it felt like a necessary thing to do, but you know, all these guys have tough moments, and that's one for him.
He was 93 when he died in 1989. Did you talk to him?
Yeah, Walter talked to him more than I did, but Walter talked to him quite a bit. He was a wonderful storyteller. His stories improved a little bit, like they do for all of us. We joked about it in one particular meeting. McCloy in real life was on the edge of the room. This is a meeting on dropping the atom bomb in 1945. By the time McCloy finished telling the story, his position had moved from the edge of the room to a chair right next to the president. This is this natural tendency to self-aggrandize. McCloy suffered from it, as we all do.
How much did he have to do with starting the Council on Foreign Relations? And if he did, why?
The council was around before McCloy, but McCloy became a kind of a exemplar of it. This idea, that there was an establishment. There's a building on 68th Street. It's the Council on Foreign Relations, and it looks like a private club, feels like a private club inside, and it was kind of the meeting place of all the mandarins of foreign policy. They would, and it was started really. I think it's an interwar thing. It starts going after World War One. McCloy becomes a symbol of it, but he's not. I'm trying to remember. I'm thinking of Hamilton Fish Armstrong was the first editor of of Foreign Affairs, their magazine. They got important partly because of George Kennan, who we haven't gotten to, wrote the famous X article declaring that, hey, we got to watch out for the Soviet Union. and that ran in Foreign Affairs, their publication, and that kind of put them on the map as here's the brain trust, like the think tank, the brain trust of the establishment. It's the what they call the Council up there on 68th Street.
What did he really stand for when it came to the policy in those back in those years?
He was not an ideologue. I mean, he was neither a Republican nor a Democrat, really. What he was a believer in American power, Pax Americana, and the American peace. And some of this was, if you want to be a revisionist critic of this, was to preserve American money making, make the world safe for American banks. But that's not my view. My view is he wanted a world that is dominated by America, yes, but with the intent and the reality of making it free for democracy and for freedom, also for free trade, a rules-based global order of free traders which spreads democracy and freedom. That's the world that John J. McCloy wanted.
Another of the six that died in the same year that Averell Harriman did was in 1986 was Bob Lovett. Who was he?
He's the guy you never heard of. Always behind the scenes, incredibly effective. He was his family was originally from Texas, but really he was a Yale skull and bones, absolute center of the establishment. He was a partner in an investment banking house called Brown Brothers Harriman, Harriman as in Averell Harriman, and he and Harriman were partners at making money on international finance. So they have a foot in the world, business foot in the world, doing business with Europe. They knew Europe, and but also part of this kind of Northeast establishment. And Lovett comes in. Lovett and McCloy are special assistants to a guy named Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War in World War II. And they kind of run World War II, those two guys. Lovett ran the American Air Force, really, and was a great inside player. He didn't like to be in the newspapers. You never heard of him, but he was incredibly effective at everything up to and including dropping the atom bomb. He became the number two guy at the State Department after the war. Again, you never heard of him, but he's getting things done like NATO. he would had to persuade the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg, that it was a good thing for America to be in alliance with Europe, a real alliance. And Bob Lovett would bring him top secret cables at the end of the day, and they would drink martinis together. And Lovett would work Vandenberg to get him to commit America to this global alliance, NATO alliance. That was as much Bob Lovett's creation as anybody. He was just incredibly, he was staying out of the newspapers, but boy, was he effective.
He was Secretary of Defense in 51 to 53. That was, of course, right in the middle of the start of the Korean War.
Korean War, yeah. That's less important. Actually, I know it's the most important job he had, but his important jobs came before that. He also was very involved in the buildup of American defense. He was a principal author of something called NSC 68, this document that said, look, the United States has got to really build its defenses, spend a lot of money building its nuclear power, but also conventional forces, really spend a lot of money on it. And we did. People forget in the 50s, half the budget was defense. Today, it's like 6% or something. In those days, it was half. This was before the welfare state, before Social Security and Medicare chewed up most of the budget. In those days, the welfare state was small. The defense budget was huge, relatively speaking.
And I guess he also was a Republican?
Yeah, this is a sort of a nominal thing. I don't think it really means anything. Party didn't mean much to these guys. Yeah, nominally a Republican, but really he was pro-American international power. That was their party.
Evan, why did these men talk to you and Walter Isaacson? How did you get in to talk to them?
That's a good question. They were, I think they were feeling a little forgotten in the mid 1980s. I think they realized that people had forgotten how important they were. I mean, I hate to impute vanity to them because they were a pretty secure bunch. So you would think they would not need uh, you would not need the publicity or the credit. But I think they were kind of glad to be talking to these whippersnappers who were going to tell their story because their story had been forgotten and also sort of glazed over. That material, particularly in the academy, in the academic world, was really in those days revisionist, and it was criticizing the United States for starting the Cold War. You know, the vogue in history in the academic side was the United States was to blame for the Cold War. You know, it was America's fault. We shouldn't have dropped the atom bomb. We started so I think they're a little annoyed by all that, and they were happy to try to educate these. I call those whippersnappers. We were in our mid-30s, which feels pretty young to me now because I'm 73. But you know, we were young, and I think they were glad to, and we were curious, and they were glad to talk to us. Kennan a little bit less so. He didn't know what the hell. He thought we were just kind of a couple of graduate students. Uh, but the other guys who were still alive were perfectly happy to talk to us. And you know, when you get to be older, you're glad to tell your story. And I was working with Walter Isaacson, one of the great reporters in the history of the world, who could get blood out of a stone. He could get anybody talking to him. And I was with him, and so he had no problem getting people talking generally, and certainly these fellas. So it wasn't that hard.
Can people? Well, better way is this book still actively available for people if they want to buy it?
Oh yeah. You know, believe it or not, Walter and I still make enough money off of this book to about once every 6 months to buy dinner. It sells about 3 or 4 thousand copies a year. It's sold. Not a huge number, but sells some copies every year. This book has been out for almost 40 years now.
Where do you know of a place where they use it in a way that it's the kind of thing that you like to know about?
No, I think I don't. I think schools don't use it because it's considered to be extolling, you know, dead white men. Uh, so I don't think it's on curriculum. Maybe at a few places, but generally not on school curriculums. I think it has a life just word of mouth. You can buy it on Amazon. You know, it's not. It's been through many printings, um, but it doesn't sell that much. I mean, it sells maybe 3,000 copies a year. Part of that is because Walter Isaacson is famous. So because of Isaacson's name, people buy the book.
And you're not,
Not like Walter Isaacson.
but you've
No,
done 11 books and
no,
very.
but Walter's book. I mean, I sell about a tenth as many books as Walter does. Walter sold more. Walter's biography of Steve Jobs sold more books in Japan than I have in the world lifetime. Over 1 million. I think maybe I've sold maybe 1 million books. I think Walter sold 1 million in Japan, just that one book.
And you mentioned the one we haven't talked about yet. George Kennan lived to be 101, was a graduate of Princeton from Milwaukee originally. And I remember, I think you said in your book, he was a conservative's conservative.
Yeah, he sure was. He wasn't sure he was in favor of democracy. He really thought that the world ought to be run by some kind of Platonic council of wise men, elder types, because he didn't trust the people. He would be so appalled by Donald Trump. If he wasn't dead already, he'd fall over dead. I mean, he was a very elitist guy that way. He just thought the world should be run by smart guys like him. And he's famous because he wrote as a fairly young Foreign Service officer, essentially a warning to Washington that Russia is ambitious, global ambitions. We have to stand up to him. It was called the X article, appeared in Foreign Affairs. And he's the author of what became known as the containment doctrine, this idea that we had to contain Soviet power. This was he's been credited with it. Uh, I guess he deserves it. He certainly was the one who articulated it most eloquently. It was picked up by less eloquent people and overdone a little bit. I mean, we think we overdid containment. Uh, they took George Kennan's ball. In fact, Kennan himself said it was like kicking a boulder down a hill that suddenly becomes an avalanche. Kennan himself kind of didn't disavow his own theory, but thought crude American politicians had gone too far with his own theory. They had militarized containment. They had made it too much of a military thing as opposed to a diplomatic thing, and had gone overboard. So he was disappointed with the fruits of his own creation.
What are the circumstances around the long telegram?
The long telegram was he was a Foreign Service officer in Moscow after the war, and he's sick, and he sends a telegram back to Washington that says basically the Russians are coming, and that they're ambitious, and we have to stand up to them. That really is the beginning of containment. I mentioned the X article. It really starts with a long telegram. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. It starts with what you're talking about. He's a Foreign Service officer sending a cable back to headquarters saying, watch out, the Russians are coming. This long telegram gets picked up by Forrestal, the defense secretary, and others, and they go around the Washington bureaucracy saying, look at this, the Russians are coming. We need to stand up to them and contain them. Then Kennan takes basically the long telegram, turns it into an article called the X article, that appears in Foreign Affairs, and that becomes kind of the credo, the original document of really the Cold Warriors, of the need to contain Soviet power.
Where did you talk to George Kennan when you sat down for an interview?
In the bar of the Century Association in New York, a very appropriate place for this. The Century Association is like the council. It's kind of the ground zero of the estate. My father was a member of it. I was a member of it for a while. And it was a very fancy New York men's club that is with intellectual pretensions, and actual intellectual. I mean, there's not just pretensions, but intellectuals belong to it. Not me, some other, but others. And that's where he wanted to meet us. So that's where we met him. I think he wasn't quite sure who he was talking to. I know that when he actually saw the manuscript of the book sitting on a friend's coffee table, he picked it up and read and went, "Oh my God, what is this? What have I done? who have I talked to?" And he used this wonderful put down adjective for us. He referred to Walter and I as jejune, young, naive, inexperienced, because he didn't like the portrait that we painted of him, which was we made him to seem like an arch elitist, which he was, and kind of anti-democratic. And so he was offended by that.
Ambassador to Yugoslavia, 61. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, 52. Counselor at the State Department in 49. Of course, he was active before then. And as I said earlier, he lived to be 101. I have to, though, read one thing that caught my attention is that you said that he used to socially would sit around with some of his friends and read excerpts from the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and some of Chekhov's plays till people were looking at each other saying, how long is this going to go on?
Yeah. He was not, I mentioned charm here has its place. Bob Lovett, very charming. Dean Acheson in his own way, charming. Bohlen, very charming. McCloy, very charming. Kennan was a loner and unpopular at Princeton, very unclubbable. He wasn't. He didn't get it. I don't think he got into any club at Princeton. He was a lonely, self-pitying Midwesterner, but there was a sweet side to him, and he was sort of adopted by the preppies and the clubbies later after school. But he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and they loved him and they embraced him, but they kind of would roll their eyes when he's sitting there reading Chekhov at them. He had a farm. People go out there for the weekend to his farm, and they would kind of roll their eyes. He made them paint the fence and do things that weren't kind of fun. But they really appreciated his brilliance. And there was a sweet, and although I portrayed him as this kind of fierce anti-democratic type, there was a sweet and thoughtful side to him. People are complicated, and Kennan was really complicated. And he was very sensitive. He won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of times for his writing. He was just a brilliant writer and a very thoughtful guy. And he was out of a Chekhov play. I mean, he was He was a very sensitive, you might say oversensitive guy, but he could see things that other people could not.
You said in the book that Averell Harriman was disconsolate when Reagan began fulminating against the evil empire. And I bring that up because I want to ask you if Reagan was right.
Well, I think that Harriman thought that Reagan was going too far here, and remember Harriman's basic rule is that you can deal with the Russians, you can talk to them, and if you call them the evil empire, they're less likely to talk to you. And what Harriman wanted to do was arms control negotiations, and he wanted to negotiate with the Russians. It doesn't help negotiations when you say somebody's evil. And I think that Harriman thought that Reagan was kind of naive and some actor from California, sure wasn't Groton in Skull and Bones. I think Harriman was wrong about Reagan. I think Reagan wanted to negotiate from a position of strength. I think we ultimately realized that. And Reagan was pretty effective in the long run. But I know that Harriman was offended by him initially.
All right, it's time to bring it to the present. One of the reasons to ask you about this book is to compare these men, their background, what they did with what's going on today. And I just made a list of 14 of President Trump's nominees for the cabinet. And it's just a very different profile, including the fact that there are 4 out of 14. 4 of them had any kind of a degree from Harvard, 1 from the University of Pennsylvania, and 1 from Princeton. The rest are all over the lot: Florida State, Hawaii Pacific, Albany Law School, the Baptist, the Ouachita Baptist for Mike Huckabee, University of Maryland for Susie Wiles. You know where I'm coming from, too.
Look, I don't think that Harvard, Princeton, Yale have any monopoly on knowledge or wisdom. I don't. In fact, you can make an argument, and I will make it, that those schools have gone overboard in recent years in the direction of progressivism. They've become too woke. I have this view. So I'm not going to make some brief here for Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. I think what matters is the quality of the people you pick. That's what matters. I don't care if they're from Wichita State or where they're from. I care if they're smart, capable, experienced. That's the real test. And I am impressed by, now as we're speaking here, some of Trump's picks look ridiculous. Matt Gaetz, I think that's Trump being a bully, trying to show that he can get his way, sort of force it down, telling the Congress, heel, like a dog. So I think it's sort of a bully play for some of these guys. Others are more impressive. More capable. The nominee for Secretary of Defense, Rubio, the Secretary of State, they're better. So it's it's a mixed bag. But that's the test is not where you went to school. The test is how competent are you.
But compare the environment back then. We had the bomb, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. You can go down the list, Afghanistan, Iraq, and compare that to people that are going to have to run this world for possibly the next 4 years. They don't have the Ivy League schools or the Grotons or all that kind of stuff. Will that make a difference?
No, it doesn't. Again, I don't think it makes any difference whether you went to Groton. I really don't. What
But
matters is
more than anything, I'm talking about the friendships and the involvement with one another, whether that makes any difference or not.
That's an interesting question. That's a harder question. I think there's something to be said for knowing each other, for having a shared interest, for being able to talk to each other. I think we lost something when government got too big. It was tiny when these guys were setting, when we were creating NATO and the Marshall Plan, there was no national security advisor or national security staff. It was just a couple of guys having cocktails. It was a smaller world, and the ability to talk to each other, relate to each other, get stuff done. I think we've lost something by getting too big and too bureaucratic. Now, it's inevitable that if you want to run the world, you're going to end up creating big bureaucracies. Of course you are. How could you not? But I think we did lose something on that. Now, the argument against that, of course, is too insular. If everybody knows each other, they have the same mindset, the same worldview, too insular. You need outsiders to disrupt. I also believe in that. I think you do need outsiders. You do need disruptors. I think this is a really complicated question. I can hear myself just bloviating here because I don't really know what the hell I think.
But if you step back from, is there any chance that because this group all thought somewhat alike, I know they didn't, everything wasn't the same for each of them, that helped us go to Korea, which helped us go to Vietnam, and were they advising? I mean, I know they changed at the end, but
Yeah.
a lot of people changed at the end. Did
Yeah.
that create those environments?
Yeah, well, one thing you're getting at is, the title of the book is The Wise Men. They weren't so wise at the end. There's a problem when you bring in old wise men to advise you. They're stuck in the past. And although I think the wise men were fantastic when they were in power, in government, when they were younger, creating the Western Alliance and Pax Americana, they were not so wise when it came to Vietnam. Most of them wanted to double down and go further and harder. Now they turned against Johnson and Vietnam, and there's a famous meeting we describe in the book in 1968 where they say, "Okay, enough already. We need to get out." But before that, they encouraged LBJ to get deeper in. They did that because they were old men who were a little out of it. They didn't have current information. They were accorded too much deference. I mean, I know this sounds a little ironic. I wrote a book called The Wise Men, and I'm saying they weren't that wise. They were not that wise towards the end. And the problem, I think it's a problem when governments bring in outsiders who are past their prime, who don't know that much, who are too set in their ways. Dean Acheson became a kind of an uber hawk in his old age. And I don't think he gave good advice to Jack Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, bomb Cuba. That was not good advice. He was pro intervention in Vietnam. That was not good advice. He changed his mind on Vietnam. That was good advice. But, it's at best a mixed picture. At the end of their lives, they were not that wise.
Your last chapter called Legacy, as I was reading it, I was thinking about, I did an interview with Robert McNamara far after he was Secretary of Defense and the head of the World Bank, and that his book came out, and after his book came out. And I interviewed him in his office, and I'm bringing this up, you'll see, for a reason. He was in an office. He didn't have a secretary. It was one of those multiple offices that people can have when they are not running anything. There was a receptionist at the front desk. And I walked in and I kept thinking to myself, wow, here is this very significant, important, visible person in the past who ends up at a desk by himself in a building and nobody pays much attention to him. And I bring this up because I wanted you to explain what it was like for these 6 men at the end of their lives.
Yeah, that's a poignant scene. I had the same one. I went and interviewed at McNamara at his apartment with nobody there. And I thought, wow, how the mighty have fallen. Were they sad at the end? Did they feel left behind? That's a very moving question. I think every powerful man, Dean Acheson said, giving up power is like the end of a love affair. He missed it. He argued 20 cases before the Supreme Court after he left government, but he always missed power. I think they all did. I think when you have that kind of power, it is like the end of a love affair. You miss it. And it's not so much that nobody recognizes you in the street, because some of these guys were happy not to be recognized. That was part of their power. Was that they were behind the scenes. That was part of their power. But I think they missed the power.
I think you said in your book that Dean Acheson argued 15 cases straight through at the court at least and lost them all.
Yeah, because he's representing losing cases for large corporations.
Did all of this, we talk about this all the time in this town, did all of this end up being a good thing for them that they had been in government, and were they able then to make a lot of money because of it?
Although they started with a lot of money. Well, most of them did. Yeah, they cashed in. I mean, they already had money, so it's a little of my answer's a little blurry. They were mostly pretty prosperous. Not Kennan, but Kennan became a comfortable academic at the Institute for Advanced Studies up at Princeton, where I am right now, actually. Blah, 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 blah. Did they do this to cash in? No. Were they venal? No. They were already rich. They didn't need the money.
Was Kennan run out of Princeton?
No, Kennan. Well, let's see. Kennan was at the Institute of Advanced Studies, which is actually not part of Princeton University. It's right adjacent to it. He was there to the end of his life.
So, as an observer, 11 books later, of the world, sum up how you feel about the current state of this country as it relates to the world.
Well, I'm worried like everybody else because World War III seems a little closer now. I'm a huge believer in America. Do not bet against America. We are a dynamic country. What we're talking about, this foreign policy elite, they're gone. They're history. But our country is incredibly powerful and vibrant and dynamic still. Look at, for instance, how our economy has pulled ahead of Europe's. The United States' share of the global economy is greater now considerably than it was 20 years ago. Through immigration, through social mobility, we are this unbelievably vibrant country. We need to believe in ourselves. We're the best thing that ever happened to the world. And we need to remember that.
All right. I have a pair of shoes on right now that was made in Vietnam. I have a tie on that's made in China.
Yeah.
I mean, I can go down the list.
Sure.
I mean, what's happened to us? How are we able to have this
That's a
kind of a
good
relation?
thing, Brian. That's a good thing. That means that's a triumph that we created this global economy. The whole world was lifted up by the free, rules-based, free trade economy that the United States created after World War II was good for the world. Look at the statistics on people coming out of poverty. The whole world was lifted up on this rising tide. Yes, America was more than everybody else, but everybody was lifted. We do not want to go back to a world where we are divided into warring groups that hate each other. That's not the world we want to go back to.
So are you involved in writing another book?
I'm always involved in writing another. I'm writing a book about the 6 months before Pearl Harbor, looking at Hitler, Churchill, and Roosevelt, how their rivers sort of come together on December 7th, 1941.
When do you hope to have it out?
A couple of years.
Evan Thomas, co-author, of The Wise Men with Walter Isaacson. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about a book that's almost 40 years old.
I was glad to do it, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.